They say the only constant in audio is change, but some innovations aren't just changes, they're tectonic shifts. We're counting down 5 loudspeakers that didn't just play music better, they fundamentally altered how music was conceived, mixed, and ultimately, heard. You'll know the names, but I promise you, the real reasons they faded into the dusty corners of history are not what you expect. The last 2 entries, in particular, reveal a pattern you might not have considered. Number 5. In the late 1960s, the hi-fi landscape was a bifurcated world. On one side, you had esoteric, often expensive, multi-way speaker systems designed for critical listening in dedicated rooms. On the other, you had mass-market consoles and compact systems that prioritized aesthetics and convenience over fidelity. Henry Kloss, a name synonymous with accessible high-performance audio, saw this chasm and decided to bridge it with a simple, elegant solution, the Advent loudspeaker. When you first encountered an Advent, it was often in a dorm room, a small apartment, or a burgeoning home studio. They were unpretentious, rectangular boxes, clad in either walnut vinyl or, more commonly, a rather utilitarian but rugged black finish. The drivers themselves were a marvel of minimalist engineering, a 10-inch acoustic suspension woofer with that famously wide, flexible foam surround, paired with a 1 3/4-inch, dome-style tweeter. There were no flashy grills or exotic materials, just a simple black cloth stretched over a wooden frame, secured with Velcro. What made the Advent revolutionary wasn't its looks, but its sound and its price point. At around $110 each, they delivered an astonishingly balanced, full-range frequency response that punched well above their weight. For the first time, aspiring musicians, audio engineers on a budget, and dedicated listeners could afford a speaker that offered genuine accuracy, not just loud bass, but articulate, musical bass that extended down to a solid 35 Hz. The Advent allowed a generation to hear their recordings, and indeed, recordings being made, with a level of detail and neutrality previously reserved for far more expensive equipment. Artists could mix on them, knowing that if it sounded good on an Advent, it would translate well to other systems. This democratized high-fidelity sound in a way no other speaker before it had. But its very ubiquity, its unpretentious design, and its success ultimately contained the seeds of its demise. By 1974, Advent had introduced a larger, more powerful model, the Advent-2, and then, the new Advent loudspeaker, with revised drivers and crossover. While Kloss continued to innovate with other ventures, the original Advent loudspeaker itself was gradually phased out, not because it was flawed, but because the market, fueled by its own success, demanded ever newer models and ever more incremental improvements. The original Advent was simply a victim of its own perfection and the relentless march of consumerism. It had set the bar so high, its own successors simply overshadowed it. The next one was in half the living rooms in America, and it still died. Number 4. The Acoustic Research AR-3a stands as a monument to engineering precision and a singular vision for accurate sound reproduction. When it arrived on the scene in 1967, it wasn't just another speaker, it was a statement, a benchmark against which all other loudspeakers would be judged for years to come. Imagine walking into an audio salon in the late 60s. The AR-3a often commanded a prime spot, perhaps perched on its optional, angled stands, clad in its rich, oiled walnut veneer. The front baffle was usually covered by a thick, dark brown grill cloth, subtly revealing the distinct 3-way driver arrangement beneath, a massive 12-inch acoustic suspension woofer, a unique 1.5-inch dome mid-range driver, and a 3/4-inch dome tweeter. There were no ports, no flashy adornments, just a robust, sealed enclosure that spoke volumes about its serious intent. What people loved about the AR-3a was its unwavering commitment to accuracy. It extended the revolutionary acoustic suspension principle, pioneered by AR's Edgar Vilcher, to an even higher level of refinement. The result was bass that was not merely deep, but incredibly tight, articulate, and free from the boomy resonance often found in ported designs of the era. The mid-range, often the heart of musical reproduction, was astonishingly natural, presenting vocals and instruments with a lifelike clarity that was revelatory. And the dome tweeter, a genuine innovation for its time, delivered smooth, extended highs without harshness. The AR-3a became the go-to reference speaker for audio reviewers, engineers, and serious audiophiles. It was celebrated for its low distortion, wide frequency response, and remarkable power handling. If a recording sounded good on an AR-3a, you could be confident it was a good recording. It was expensive for its time, retailing for around $250 each, but its performance justified the price. It influenced countless designs and pushed the industry towards greater fidelity. However, its very strength, its relentless pursuit of accuracy through meticulous engineering, also contributed to its eventual retreat from the forefront. By 1976, the hi-fi market was rapidly expanding and segmenting. Newer, more efficient designs began to emerge, often with flashier marketing and different sonic signatures that appealed to a broader consumer base. While the AR-3a was still revered, its relatively lower efficiency meant it required powerful amplifiers, and its aesthetic, while classic, didn't evolve significantly. The real reason the AR-3a vanished wasn't due to a flaw or a competitor outperforming it, but a subtle shift in market perception. Consumers, particularly as solid-state amplification became more prevalent, began to prioritize things like transient response, imaging, and even physical size, sometimes over the absolute neutrality the AR-3a offered. It wasn't a dramatic death, but a gradual fading as the industry pivoted towards different sonic ideals and manufacturing efficiencies. This next one didn't just change how music was heard, it changed how music was made. Number 3. When you walked into a professional recording studio in the early 1970s, there was a good chance you'd be greeted by the imposing presence of the JBL 4310 or its slightly refined successor, the 4311. These weren't speakers designed for your living room, at least not initially. They were tools, precision instruments engineered for the demanding environment of music production. Imagine a squat, almost square box, clad in a utilitarian gray vinyl finish, often sitting horizontally on a meter bridge or stand, its drivers clearly visible. The iconic blue baffle, often scuffed and worn from years of use, housed a robust 12-inch woofer, a 5-inch paper cone mid-range, and a 1.4-inch phenolic ring tweeter. There were no grills to hide the businesslike design, just 3 rotary presence and brilliance controls, inviting adjustment, a direct feedback loop for the engineer. What made the JBL 4310/4311 a game-changer was its sheer dynamic capability, its immediate punch, and its revealing clarity. Before the JBLs, many studios relied on larger, often custom-built monitor systems that were designed for playback at very high volumes, excellent for showcasing a finished track, but not always ideal for detailed mixing. The 4310/4311 offered a compelling alternative, a highly efficient, relatively compact monitor that could be placed closer to the engineer, offering an unvarnished, in-your-face presentation of the mix. This wasn't about subtle nuances, this was about hearing every drum hit, every bass line, every vocal inflection with authority. The engineers loved them because they were honest. If there was a problem in the mix, the JBLs would shout it at you. They became the workhorses of the studio, influencing countless hit records. Artists and producers trusted them because they delivered a consistent sound, allowing for reliable translation across different listening environments. The JBL sound, punchy, forward, and detailed, became synonymous with the sound of modern music production. But its very success in defining a particular sonic aesthetic eventually contributed to its decline as the dominant studio monitor. By the late 1970s and early 80s, while the 4311 was still widely used, other monitoring philosophies began to emerge. Engineers started to seek monitors with a more refined stereo image, a less forward mid-range, and a perhaps more linear frequency response, particularly as digital recording became more prevalent and demanded a different kind of transparency. The real reason the 4310/4311 eventually faded from its absolute peak of ubiquity wasn't a sudden failure, but a gradual evolution of taste and technology in the studio. Engineers started asking for different characteristics in their monitors, and while the JBLs remained excellent, their specific sonic signature, once a strength, became a characteristic that other, newer monitors sought to refine or contrast. The market, always craving the next edge, moved on to different tools for different jobs. This next speaker was hated by most, but adored by the few who needed it, and it changed music for everyone. Number 2. Walk into almost any recording studio in the world today, and you are highly likely to see, often perched on the meter bridge of a console or on small stands, a pair of relatively small, boxy, unassuming loudspeakers, the Yamaha NS-10. This is a speaker that, frankly, was never intended to be an audiophile darling. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't particularly detailed in the high end, and its bass response was polite, at best. But it became one of the most important studio tools in history. The NS-10, first introduced in 1978 as a domestic hi-fi speaker, was a two-way design featuring a 7-inch white cone woofer and a 1.5-inch soft dome tweeter, housed in a sealed, rather plain black particle board enclosure. It looked utterly forgettable, and early reviewers often panned it for its harsh mid-range and lack of bass extension. In Japan, it quickly faded from the consumer market. Yet, somehow, in the early 1980s, it began to appear in American recording studios, most notably at the famous Power Station in New York City. Why? Because recording engineers, tired of mixing on overly flattering, large studio monitors, found something uniquely useful in the NS-10, brutally honest, unforgiving mediocrity. The NS-10 had an infamous mid-range hump, a lack of deep bass, and often a bright, somewhat fatiguing top end. But here's the genius: if a mix sounded good on NS-10s, it sounded fantastic everywhere else. If you could make the vocals sit right, the kick drum cut through, and the guitars not sound grating on the NS-10s, you had a bulletproof mix. It became the lowest common denominator test. Engineers would mix the bulk of a track on their main, expensive monitors, then switch to the NS-10s for critical checks on vocal levels, sibilance, and overall balance. If the vocals disappeared or a cymbal became piercing, it was back to the drawing board. This wasn't about listening enjoyment, it was about quality control. The NS-10 effectively forced engineers to make their mixes translate perfectly to consumer-grade equipment, which was precisely what the public would be listening on. It shaped the sound of countless hit records, dictating mix choices for decades. Its white woofer cones became an iconic symbol of serious music production. But even this legendary workhorse eventually faced obsolescence. By the early 2000s, the supply chain for key components began to dry up. Specifically, the original white pulp woofer cone material, crucial to its distinctive sound, became increasingly difficult to source consistently. Yamaha faced a choice: redesign the speaker with new components, potentially altering its beloved, or hated, sonic signature, or discontinue it. They chose the latter. In 2001, Yamaha officially ceased production of the NS-10. It wasn't a sudden death by a better competitor or a change in musical taste. It was a silent, unglamorous end dictated by the quiet, industrial reality of manufacturing. A company could no longer reliably acquire the specific raw materials that made the NS-10 precisely what it was. Engineers still use them today, often with modified crossovers or aftermarket parts, but the original, mass-produced legend is gone, a testament to the fact that even a revered tool can be dismantled by the mundane realities of supply. This final speaker didn't just change how music was recorded, it changed how music was performed live, and it's a story rooted in the uncompromising vision of a single man. Number 1. When Paul W. Klipsch first unleashed the La Scala loudspeaker in 1963, it wasn't just a speaker, it was an absolute declaration. This was a loudspeaker born from a singular philosophy: extreme efficiency and unparalleled dynamics, driven by horn-loaded drivers. Unlike almost every other speaker on this list, the La Scala wasn't initially designed for the living room or the studio. Its genesis was far more practical and far more demanding. It was built to be a portable, high-output public address speaker for then Arkansas gubernatorial candidate Winthrop Rockefeller. Imagine this: a massive, folded horn bass bin forming the lower two-thirds of the cabinet, often finished in a rugged black painted plywood, designed to sit directly on the floor. Perched atop this formidable bass was a separate, smaller cabinet housing a horn-loaded mid-range compression driver and a horn-loaded tweeter. There were no grills, no fancy aesthetics, just raw, unadulterated acoustic power, and a footprint that demanded respect. This was a speaker that measured nearly 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 2.5 feet tall. What people loved, and what defined the La Scala, was its startling efficiency. Even a modest 5-watt tube amplifier could drive it to ear-splitting levels. But it wasn't just about loudness, it was about dynamics, the ability to go from pin-drop quiet to thunderous in an instant, with an attack and immediacy that was simply unmatched by conventional cone-driven speakers. The sheer scale and realism of the sound, especially with uncompressed recordings, was breathtaking. It felt like the music was truly there in the room with you. This extraordinary efficiency, combined with its robust construction, quickly found its way beyond political rallies. Touring musicians and sound engineers, desperate for powerful, reliable sound reinforcement for live concerts, discovered the La Scala. Before modern line arrays and massive PA systems, artists like the Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, and countless others use systems incorporating Klipsch and La Scalas for their raw power and clarity on stage. The La Scala provided the foundation for what would become large-scale live sound, allowing bands to play larger venues and project their music to bigger audiences with unprecedented impact. It wasn't just a speaker in the living room, it was a fundamental component in the evolution of rock concerts and large-scale public address. Yet, despite its legendary status and continued production today, the La Scala's moment as the revolutionary game-changer eventually passed. Its very design, so perfect for its initial purpose, made it less adaptable to the changing tides of audio. As dedicated sound reinforcement companies developed specialized, modular PA systems with narrower dispersion patterns and even greater power handling, the bulky, often unwieldy La Scala, with its wide dispersion and massive footprint, became less practical for large-scale concert touring. In the consumer space, while still cherished by enthusiasts, its physical size and horn-loaded characteristics meant it occupied a niche, rather than mass-market, position. The real reason the La Scala, as a revolutionary force, faded was not due to a defect or a superior competitor in its original role, but because the audio world it helped create ultimately outgrew its form factor. The very technology and methodologies it inspired evolved to require different solutions for both live sound and domestic listening, relegating it to a beloved, but ultimately specialized, icon. The common thread running through all these stories isn't just innovation, but the subtle, relentless pressure of changing market demands and the unavoidable march of technological evolution. Even the most revolutionary designs eventually yield to new problems, new tastes, or simply the scarcity of a